In a broad sense, we have this idea that, I'll say it's my opinion that we have this idea that education happens in the school building, and that's over there, and they have teachers and staff that take care of it, and we should let them do that. I think it is wholeheartedly incorrect.
The pandemic only exacerbated those inequities that have always been there. We just don't want to fund all schools at the same levels because we don't feel that all kids deserve the same access and opportunities as their counterparts.
I would define the digital divide as technological access, right? And as like a first point, but then the implications of having access to technology and not having access to that technology, which makes the problem substantially larger, right? Just think about having the internet versus not having the internet. Like that's a vast difference in today's society, and I think unfortunately, Black and brown students, Black and brown families tend to be more on the side of not having access to that technology, and so thus being at a detriment, a deficit, if you will, in many areas.
I would have to say that the digital divide is a word that has been created by capitalists. I feel that the main issue that has not been addressed within our communities really is poverty. And the pandemic only exacerbated those inequities that have always been there. We just have refused to really address them, and we've covered it up with, tax costs, housing costs, and how all of those things contribute to the quality of schools, when in reality, we just don't want to fund all schools at the same levels because we don't feel that all kids deserve the same access and opportunities as their counterparts.
These are not new challenges, right? Certain communities have certain things, right? I'm of the belief that children learn. I think that's fact, right? That's what they do from the time that they're born. They learn and they adapt, and largely due to the environment that they're in, right? So we look at a person like Bill Gates, right? We understand the level of access that Bill Gates had to a computer at such a young age, such an early age. I'm not taking anything away from his genius. I do believe he's brilliant. I do think, though, brilliant or not, LeBron James or not, if you practice the correct way, you get better at the skill, right? So if you give me an extra 10 years in working on technology, having access, exploring the internet, learning how to write programs and code, etc., then I'll be good at that, right? And so some communities have more access to that. Some communities don't have as much access to that. Some communities have infrastructure that supports the access to that. Some communities don't, right? And so it is very layered. It is very nuanced. It is a bunch of loops and roundabouts to try to figure it out. Our community I serve, is being more active technologically and becoming more tech savvy. I think, first of all, the kids know how to use the technology. They're born into it. But I think the current situation that we're in terms of like a global pandemic, has forced our community to one, you have to use it. But then two, I think when you zoom out a little bit more, it's forced the world to recognize that this is a viable way to educate, and it can work. And the saying is necessity is the mother of invention, right? And it's like being in a place where we're forced to use this. You see the news all the time. It's like, oh, such and such just donated $1 million to buy laptops. Such and such company just donated $100 million to improve Wi-Fi connections in these neighborhoods. And it's like, yes, that is great. That's part of the solution. We don't need a global pandemic for that to happen, though. Right? And so that part is a little challenging to digest for me personally. And I think it's going to be helpful in closing the digital divide. But the other part, like I mentioned before, is there's the time space in the digital divide, right? If you give me 20 years of basketball practice before you start practicing, the chances are I'm probably going to be a better player than you.
My daughter's name is Renee Lillian Rose, and she is 4 years old. Can I tell you the meaning behind her name? She is named after both of her grandmothers who have, gone on to glory. Both my mom and my husband's mom were named Renee. Then she's also named after my father's grandmothers. So that is Lillian Jones from Sumter, South Carolina, and also Rose Wadsworth, who her father came here from Alabama. He was actually, he left in the dead of night, fleeing from the KKK, brought his family here, and I can trace my family's roots to Newark back to the 1800s, and most of my family is buried right in Fairmount Cemetery. We have a whole plot of land. I'm very proud of that. Rose Wadsworth was a fierce woman. She was a businesswoman, owned a 3-family home on Chadwick Avenue, and she took care of her family, she took care of her community, and that's why I named my little fierce, and you've seen Renee, so we call her Rosie because she has the spirit of my Nana in her. From the generation, civil rights generation, from the 60s, the Black Panther movement in the 60s and the 70s, to then how our communities were targeted during the 80s, that's where we lost our fire, if you will. Because in the 60s and 70s, we were emboldened, for lack of a better term, and we were willing to speak up about the issues. And I feel like we are back at that place. But I feel like in the 80s and I feel like in the 90s, there were some things that were lost that we're just now starting to get back, right? And so in that, like, my parents were not necessarily in the space to give me everything that I needed, right? And so that makes me even more, bold to make sure I'm getting, Renee all the things that she needs. And when I have these conversations with, like, my friends and whatnot, we talk about being first generation college students and things of that nature, it's sad to us that we are having these conversations, but it has made us stronger in the sense of knowing that we have to advocate for our children. And so when I think about that partnership between a parent and educator, I think about how I would have wanted someone to reach out to, my mom, or how I would have wanted someone to say, hey, this child is really gifted. We need to put them in, like, gifted and talented classes. We need to make opportunities for this kid. Like, this kid needs to be moved here, right? And they're definitely, I've seen that among some people that I know where those things have happened, right? But not all educators are equipped to think like that, because not all educators come to the profession with the want and the desire to really help kids. If we're being honest, some come because maybe it's a career change and some things didn't work out and they're like, okay, I want to teach, but their passion isn't there. Now, for the ones that they have that passion, they love kids, this is what they do, those teachers, those educators go above and beyond for their kids. They show it in the love, but also they're not paid. Let's talk about that. They're not paid. So these are like all of the different mitigating factors that make for either a healthy relationship or a toxic relationship, because at the end of the day, a parent and an educator are both people, right? And so when people come to a relationship, we have to remember that you're bringing your whole self and you're each two individuals. And in order for you all to be able to do something together, you have to know where each other are coming from. And there has to be like a common understanding and also a common goal. And that common goal is your kid. So if a parent comes in hot and fiery, of course the educator is not necessarily going to be responsive in the way that you would hope that they would be responsive. And vice versa. And some educators have to understand that some parents have had traumatic experiences in education. Maybe they didn't finish, maybe they didn't finish school, or maybe they had a teacher and you remind them of that teacher who told them that they weren't going to be anything, even though they've gone on and have broken down all the barriers, but there's still that wound, that is open. And so I think when you're trying to develop that relationship, you really just have to be conscious of that fact that educators are human, just like you. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Golden rule.
I think in a broad sense, we have this idea that, I'll say it's my opinion that we have this idea that education happens in the school building, and that's over there, and they have teachers and staff that take care of it, and we should let them do that. I think it is wholeheartedly incorrect. So I think the first thing is we have to transform this notion that education's over there, they do it. We all need to be involved in education. We all need to be educating it in some aspect. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is we need to engage, right? Like, we need to engage at every level. Right, we need to be providing resources. We need to getting the laptops out and the bandwidths and the internet access and all those things. It's a great start. That's part of the solution. It's not the solution though, right? Like these aren't things that Band-Aids fix, right? Cities like Newark, including Newark, need more access. We need more opportunity space, because at the end of the day, what the internet and technology and access to information, what it's gonna do is level the playing field, right? Like if I can get on the internet and I can have access to the same information that someone else in some other suburb living a whole different lifestyle has a different set of accesses. Speaking frankly, me living in poverty, we don't have to have that disconnect. Access to information can level the playing field. And that's what really, I think that's what it's really about. When you think about pre-internet, you think about Britannica, you think about encyclopedias, you think about where the information was stored. And I'm just, I'm talking in my lifetime. You can look through history and see this. The people with the information tend to make the decisions on what happens. And so having access, equitable access to information, helps to level that playing field. And as a just rough example, not having that access, what does that prepare me for? A job, a career, manual labor? Maybe. There's nothing wrong with manual labor. Not at all. But there's something very wrong with that being my only option. There's nothing wrong with community college or any of these other one-off boxes. But there's a problem when that's my only option and I'm forced to go to that. I'm forced to go into that direction, right? So I think what I'd like to see is more access, more equitable access, more classes. Quote from a friend of mine, back in the MySpace days, She say, we were flirting with $1 million skills and we didn't even know it. We're like getting the code and changing our backgrounds and changing our pictures, and we got music players on our MySpace pages. We were flirting with $1 million ideas and didn't know it, and nobody was telling us, and nobody was creating the space for us. I don't want to say nobody because I don't know everything, but it wasn't being cultivated, right? There should have been, and I know some organizations are doing this now. There's camps, there's coding. But the other piece that I do want to mention about this is, it's not just, from my observations, it's not just like a school space or this local community space. When you think about black tech in its entirety, it's a very small percentage of just people of color in general. You can deduce reasons for that, as you wish. Maybe there's like, let's assume the best of everybody, and maybe there's no foul play or anything, but it's just like, these are the skills we need for these positions, and these people maybe don't have the skills. Maybe that's the case. Do they have access to develop the skills, though? Does the community that they come from provide the access for them to develop the skills? Do they have access to the technology? Do they have access to the information? How do you solve a problem that you don't know exists?
And so I just feel like this is the time. And if we miss this moment, we are doing us, our kids, civilization, a great disservice if we do not reimagine what education can look like, if we do not decolonize, deindustrialize what education has become, if we do not address the systemic issues that lie within our education system, then we are not going to have the leaders that we want to take us into the next century. We're just not going to have that because they are not going to be prepared. And you cannot tell me that this last year was not a loss. It was. I mean, we're talking about, COVID-19 loss, pandemic slide, but it's so much more than that. When the kids return, and they're going to return for 6 weeks, and then school's going to be done for the summer, but when the kids return, they have to be re-socialized back into school, even to get into that mind frame of being in school. And when I think about the kids who have exceptionalities and their brains work differently than everyone else, where they think in different ways and they have different abilities, my heart really breaks for them, because we really did not think about what it was that they really needed during this time, and we focused more on the abled kids, and we did not provide for them in the way that we should have. And now we are re-putting them back into the world, and we're basically telling them that all of the accommodations that you said that you needed, that we told you no, that you couldn't have those accommodations, but then during the pandemic it was like, oh, you get an accommodation, and you get an accommodation, you get an accommodation, because now it became an everybody problem, and it wasn't just, my cousin Janae's problem, it wasn't just one of my friend's son's problems. Now everyone had to be at home, so now we can magically find the tools in order to be able to increase access, right? So I just hope that if we have learned anything from this, it's that we have the tools and the capabilities to be able to level the playing field. We just have to have the desire. And I hope that speaks to the hearts of administrators in the education system.